Bulavinaka, this is Pacific Waves from RNZ Pacific. I'm Elisha Foon. Coming up.
This is a disaster. They have to compensate our district because this is the sustainable living of our people in South Africa economy.
Villagers living near the shipwrecked Manawanui are demanding compensation. Also,
even with stereo power, there's always a blackout at least, twice, 3 times a week.
a former Papua New Guinea Prime Minister wants answers after a major power provider threatened to pull the plug on Port Moresby. And later, we get an update on how the economy is faring across the region. Villagers along the south coast of Upolu in Samoa near the shipwrecked Manawanui are demanding compensation from the New Zealand government, saying the maritime disaster has affected their livelihoods. About 60 New Zealand Defence Force personnel and specialists are working alongside local authorities after the sinking of the Royal New Zealand Navy vessel on October 5th. Officials estimate that approximately 200,000 litres of diesel has leaked from the vessel. Grace Fiavai has more.
People from the village of Tawhitowala who were closest to the wreck say they want compensation, as do those from the village of Safata to the west who are holding a district meeting this Friday. Former MP Tuia Pualeota, who was from the district, says contrary to Judith Collins' earlier comments, this is not a trickle. He says this is a disaster.
The statement from the Honourable Prime Minister of Defence in New Zealand, it really makes us feel very little. This is not a trickle. This is a disaster. They have to compensate our district because this is the sustainable living of our people in South Africa. Economy is 50% of our income sources come from the ocean.
However, the Prime Minister, Fiamea Naomi Mataafa, says clear evidence of environmental impacts would be needed before any conversation on compensation can be had.
Any question about compensation is something a long way down the line, if at all. We have to prioritize first and foremost the containment of the situation and just to ensure that there is no further leakage, and that's, the priority between the two governments and the work that's been undertaken by the specialists that are here.
Fiamea said the latest information she had was that the tank that was leaking oil had been blocked.
The latest information we have is that there was one tank where there was the leakage and they've been able to block that. The tanks that are intact, the work that's been undertaken now is how do they actually take those up from the ship.
A villager who wishes to remain anonymous for fear of pushback says they are not allowed to fish on their reef and are having to fork out more petrol to go further to catch the fish they rely on for food and income.
That calls for more fuels, and you know how the fuels get expensive now. Yeah, so I think that's what makes it harder. So sometimes, not every time that the fishing boat goes out, comes back with a catch. So that's another thing that adds on to the hardship that we're kind of like facing now.
Fiamea says there are no talks of the Manawanui being salvaged this week, as leaders from 56 nations are set together in Apia for the 27th Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting next Monday.
It's a security issue, so that's ongoing at the moment, whether the work can continue or whether it needs to be on hold, once the king arrives.
But even as the world's attention on Samoa turns to Chogam, locals are also preparing to set their alarm clocks for their annual cultural event, which involves catching the local delicacy called the Balolo reef worm. Just before dawn during the end of October, locals flock to the reefs with their nets, buckets and lanterns in canoes or bao. But because of the Manawanui disaster, the villages and districts of Safata, Seomo and Tawhitowala might not be able to fish on their own reef and may have to venture further out to sea. Former Prime Minister Tuila Epa Sailele Malielegaoi says the affected villages are meeting to discuss the approach to be taken, especially drawing the government's attention to the challenge they now face.
The rising of Palolo, this is the famous cuisine 7 days after full moon, is expected to take place about the 20th. Of this month. It means the whole village will lose out in respect of the Palolo rice.
Tuila Epa says there are still a lot of unanswered questions, including why the Manawanui was so close to the reef in bad weather that fateful evening.
A former Papua New Guinea Prime Minister wants answers after a major power provider threatened to pull the plug on Port Moresby on Monday. Dario Energy is unhappy with PNG Power, claiming it owes it tens of millions of dollars in unpaid bills. But Peter O'Neill accused them of trying to hold the people of Port Moresby for ransom. He has also raised questions about who actually owns the company. Don Wiseman spoke with our PNG correspondent, Scott Whitey.
They argue and they've gone to court about it, and they've said that PNG Power owes them 240 million kina as per an agreement that they have to supply electricity to the PNG Power grid. Now, PNG Power apparently hasn't paid that money, so they've gone to court about it. 2 weeks ago, the judge, he actually refused to give orders, but he encouraged them to meet and talk about it and find a way forward. And that's basically for the benefit of Port Moresby residents. Yesterday, Dario Power issued a statement saying that they would cut off power at midday because apparently the discussions hadn't been successful or hadn't happened. And that brought about a response, a very strong response from former Prime Minister Peter O'Neill, who's basically questioned the ownership of Dario Power and the interest behind it, and he's also called on the Prime Minister to intervene and put this matter to rest. So that's basically the gist of the issue.
Was the power cut on Tuesday afternoon?
I wasn't able to confirm, but even with Dario Power, there's always a blackout at least, twice, 3 times a week. So it wouldn't have made a difference if Dario actually cut the power. There'd still be blackouts.
One of the concerns that Peter O'Neill has raised is that there appears to be some offshore ownership in this company. He wants the provincial governments involved to come clean and explain just what's what with this company. He's very exercised about this whole thing.
Yeah, not many people know about the actual ownership of Dario Power. I mean, on paper, it's owned by MRDC and a few provincial governments, as they say. But Peter O'Neill's come out and just basically exposed a whole lot of things that many people weren't aware of, and also questioning the end game as to why Dario's pushing for that 240 million now. And he's questioning where the push factor is coming from, where the push and pull factors are coming from. And he's also named a few individuals who are supposed owners of Dario Power, and is questioning why the Prime Minister hasn't actually intervened on this matter quickly.
Dario is a company that has come into being because it's able to access LNG from the huge LNG sites in the Highlands. What is the tie-up there? How did that all happen? How did these particular people get a handle on a vast supply of LNG?
That's one of the things that a lot of Papua New Guineans are questioning. I mean, how the deal was put together in the first place. And one of the outspoken critics of this deal has been former PNG Defence Force Commander Brigadier Major General Jerry Sindro. He's basically come out and said that the cost at which PNG Power is paying Dario is overpriced compared to other power suppliers. So there's a whole range of issues that need to be explained, and nobody's actually come out and clearly explained, one, the deal, how it was put together, who the interests are behind Dario, and whether that agreement is fair on ordinary Papua New Guineans.
Meanwhile, gas, as you say, outages in Port Moresby, and do outages happen in other centres around the country?
Yeah, outages far worse in outer centres, especially those that use diesel genset. I mean, if you look at the situation of Manus has diesel gensets. All its fuel has to be sourced from outside of Manus. Now, if the weather's bad, if the ships don't come through, then the blackouts continue indefinitely. And this year alone has been quite bad for them because the costs to business have gone up. The power supply has been irregular because of the fuel supply, basically. So you replicate that with outer-lying provinces in the islands, in some highlands provinces, and you get a situation that's extremely dire.
The latest World Bank Pacific Economic Update calls for a major boost in investment in the region. Economic growth has decreased to 3.6% this year, down from 5.8% in 2023. Weaker investment in the region, natural disasters and climate change are expected to keep holding growth back. Senior Pacific country economist Ika Vashak Matsi told Caleb Fotheringham the region is continuing to recover from impacts of the pandemic.
Most of it is deceleration from this very extraordinary quick rebound after opening up the borders, and also global delayed recovery in trade and travel. So the region accelerated very strongly. First, Fiji was to rebound, and then was followed by the rest of the region. So it would have been really perfect, but there is a question about the outlook, right? So is it converging with its trend rate, slower rate, or high rates? This is the question.
Yeah, is it looking like it's going to be growth at a slower rate from here on out?
This is what is our concern. So again, it was resilient in short term, but there are some indications that going forward, growth may be lower than it was before the pandemic, that we will observe trend decline in regional growth.
And what does that actually mean for these Pacific countries? What's the concern if growth is decreasing?
So first of all, I want to say that what I'm talking about now is the aggregate growth. So every country has its own path. Now, as an aggregate for the region, of course, what it means is that with slower growth, you may not be able to undo all damage done by the shock. Just to give you an example, countries which emerged strong and quickly from the pandemic, they already returned to their pre-pandemic path, say 1 year after the shock or 2 years. We are here 5 years, and only in these 5 years, because 25 will mark 5 years, right, after the 2020 pandemic shock, only 5 years how we are finally returning to their pre-pandemic level of output. And we have one country, Palau, even still lagging. Palau is the one country in the region which has not recovered even to pre-pandemic level of its output.
I read in the report there's also less investment in the Pacific. Can you tell me why that is?
First of all, if we continue discussion about slower growth, I want to say exactly, we think that the hypothesis is that slowdown of investment was one of the reasons of slower trend growth. So that's one. Investment slowed even before the pandemic. The second observation is that the climate change and high frequency of shocks and more devastating shocks, climatic and natural hazards, are also second contributor to slower growth outlook. So you asked about the investment, why investment declined. So I think Pacific region is not unique. There are lots of studies, including by the World Bank, by Prospects Group, which are documenting very well, analytically, global investment decline trend. And this is, as I said, none of the countries was isolated from this decline. Now, on top of that trend decline, you have that shock, which clearly has not allowed countries to recover their investment quickly. For example, to give you an example, Tonga suffered the volcano eruption right around the pandemic, right before. And then it was hit by the pandemic. So in normal years where you have reconstruction immediately following the crisis, here because of the pandemic, it was delayed. So this is just one of the examples how pandemic exacerbated, right, investment slowdown. Slowdown, we talk here about the accounting terms. You take the investment and you look what is the rate of investment, right? In aggregate terms, because investment contraction, in aggregate, you will see slow investment.
When we look at different industries, what industries could the Pacific rely on to improve its growth? It seems like tourism has obviously been a big focus for the Pacific, but have we reached capacity with our tourism, and do we have to look at different industries?
Yeah, I think the approach we are taking here, we don't want to pick the winners or pick somebody or just handpick and say this is exactly the sector where you need to invest. Because usually it changes, right? You need to create environment conducive, and then if you have right signals, then investors go to whatever is profitable. Now, that said, of course, we have already established sectors. And those are, for example, agriculture or fisheries or tourism. For these tourist remittances exporting countries, clearly tourism is very huge and very big. But in terms of its quality, we still think it has not reached its full potential. There's still room for innovation, for improvement, for change, especially when you talk about the revenue from tourism. Same in agriculture, for example, focusing higher crops rather than subsidizing the traditional crops. Clearly, there's room for improvement. But again, I don't want to say that this sector in this country or the other, but I want to say conducive environment for growth, then growth happens, right?
That's Pacific Waves for today. For all episodes, head over to rnz.co.nz/Pacific. We're also on Spotify, Apple and iHeartRadio. From myself and the RNZ Pacific team, tō whā soifua.